My name is Amit Bijlani, and like the other presenters this morning, if you attended any of the other talks, I work for Treehouse. Yeah. That's my Twitter handle. I don't have anything of value to tweet, but you can follow me if you like. So, does everyone know about Treehouse? Do I need to do my little spiel? All right. Well, Treehouse is an online educational company. We teach web design, web development, mobile development. That's what I teach at Treehouse. I'm the iOS development teacher at Treehouse. And we'd also teach marketing and business. Check us out at teamtreehouse.com. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the habits of an effective developer. And this is basically my personal experience and the experience of people around me that I have observed. By no means this is like the de facto standard or something like that or best practices. This is just things I've learned over the years, and I'm sure some of you must have seen this talk in some form or the other. If not, this will be a very enlightening experience for you. I hope so. So the first habit, I believe, is not really a habit because it's human nature. Because you're going to say like, well, humans understand. Sure. But as a developer, you start hacking stuff, right? I'm sure, is everyone a developer here, by the way? Show of hands, developers. Oh, awesome. All right. So when you start hacking stuff, you get into this mode where you want to get to the end goal. You want to see something working, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what happens when you hit a wall? Like you don't know how to do something, and instead of digging into the APIs or SDKs, what do? You Google it, right? And what's the first thing that happens? You come up on Stack Overflow for the answer. Yes? Right? Okay. So when you come upon the answer, you see that little check mark and you say like, wow, look at that. People have endorsed this answer. This must be good code, right? This is like code that other people have looked at. They've asked the same question and they've been struggling with the same problem that I've been having. And there's that check mark. So let me copy and paste this code into my application, my functionality, my feature. And what happens when you copy that? It has the desired effect. It starts working. Like it produces whatever you want it to produce. But what happens down the road when your app starts failing? You just copied and pasted. If you copied and pasted like a line or 2 lines of code, it's all right. But what happens when you start copying 20, 30, 40 lines of code that you don't understand? You have no idea how this thing works. So if your app starts failing, here is a bunch of code that you have no idea how it works, and you're starting to debug this code. Does everyone see where I'm going with this? So what happens when you understand that technology, that API, that SDK, whatever you're working with, or understand the code that you're working with? There are 3 things that happen. The first thing is you get better at managing your time. The second thing is you get better at estimating time. So if someone comes up to you and says, hey, can you add feature X into this app? You're like, yeah, I know how much time that's going to take. Either it's going to push out the deadline or it might not. But at least I know how to manage the time. And the third thing, which I think is the most important thing, is that your debugging time will be considerably reduced because you understand what you're working with. If you don't understand what you're working with, you won't be able to debug it. So that's understanding. That's the first habit. So once you start writing your own code and understanding it, you probably want to write good code. Oops, all right. I used to always think code is poetry. Why? Because poetry or poems show an elegant use of language. But there's a big problem with poems. They're hard to decipher. what can mean something to you can mean something completely different to someone else when it comes to poems. So I don't think code is poetry. I think it's prose. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're working on a transactional application, right? That piece of code, that's JavaScript, if you're wondering, that piece of code works. It works just fine. It takes in an argument and it deducts quantity from the item. Think of it, you're working on an app that's tied to some retail stores. The customer comes and purchases it. It deducts it from the quantity. But you come back to this piece of code weeks or even months later and you're wondering, what's this about? Like, what's going on? Like, who's calling this? Why am I deducting this? Like, I have no idea what's happening here. What if you had comments? What if the method was named aptly to what it's supposed to really do, which is update inventory? What if your comment said, hey, the argument can be a negative number because if someone returns something and you pass in a negative number, it adds it back to the inventory. Wow, it makes so much sense. I mean, this is a very simple example, but when you start small, you can have a huge impact. And it can have a really positive effect on your team. So it's all about those little things, the little details that you can pay attention to as a developer. So when you start writing good code, I mean, I can relate, like I mentioned, code is prose, right? So writing code is very much like writing a book. The first draft that you create puts your ideas together. Craig probably knows this. He's been writing books. And your draft may convey a story, but it's not elegant. And the use of language might be coarse, but it still tells that story. So when you're writing code, your first problem or your first priority is to solve a problem, because you have to find that solution to the problem you're trying to solve. So that's your first priority. You don't really care if you're writing the most elegant solution, because if you start caring about writing the most elegant solution from the get-go, you'll never finish solving that problem. So once you solve that problem, you can step back and take a look at the code that you wrote. And now you can start finding efficiencies in your code. So if you see a whole bunch of APIs peppered throughout your code, hey, let me write a service class for that. If you see a bunch of calls for image manipulation, you can say like, oh, let me write a helper class for that. So you can abstract away the complexities from your code into different layers and probably even fit them into design patterns, which we'll come to next. But it's really about abstracting away the layers of complexity. This is a really good quote that I found about refactoring. I'll just leave that up there for a second so you guys can read. I couldn't find her name, so that's her Twitter handle if anyone wants to know more about her. But it really sums up well what refactoring is about. So I did mention abstraction. And abstracting and reusability are great traits in any developer. But sometimes developers can take this really far. And what happens is that instead of just abstracting, they end up overgeneralization. Let me give you an example. I used to work for a consulting company, and we had a consulting gig with a consumer electronics company. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to create variations of their website for different countries within a region. Now, they're a consumer electronics company, so they make electronic devices, but they have a subset of those products available in different countries. So there was only one guy working on the back end of this system. And I used to call him Mr. Design Patterns because he used to love design patterns. He had like books this high about different design patterns. And what he did was his back end was beautifully architected, But it was so well architected and so well abstracted that if you went in and you wanted to modify something, you had no idea. A, there was no documentation for it. Forget about that. Because he was so busy creating all these design patterns. So you go into this backend and you're like, but I don't want to do X. I want to do Y. He's like, well, that's going to take a long time because I have to find the right design pattern to fit it into this. And I mean, it goes into the realm of like when too much is too much. And this was like way too much. So it's a delicate balance. You want to abstract, but, keep it to a minimum. Now, I did talk about design patterns. And they're not evil, by the way. If I made them sound like that they were evil, they're not evil. But think about this. You're not alone. At any given moment, whatever you're going through, somewhere, someone around the world is going through the exact same problem. And that's what design patterns are. They are the lessons others learned, and you can benefit from those lessons because they created best practices. And what design patterns give you is, if you use a design pattern, then you can get out of the way and do something that you can focus on, which is your app, your feature, your functionality. Let the design pattern do the heavy lifting, and you can focus on something fun maybe, or something more challenging. I love this quote by Jeff Atwood. If you guys don't know who that is, that was the co-founder of Stack Overflow. He's no longer there anymore. But he says, don't reinvent the wheel unless you plan on learning more about wheels. So if you want to create your own design patterns, by all means. But, if there is one that you can use, please use that. If there are a lot of are there a lot of web developers here? Is everyone a web developer? Mobile developers? All right. So in the web development community, this has kind of become standard best practice now. The mobile developers are still catching on to this, And recently I read an article on this guy's website. His name is Richard Dalton. Does anyone know who that is? No? Right. So he asked this question. Why do cars have brakes? Why do cars have brakes? To stop. Right, that's the obvious answer. But what if nobody's car had a brake? What if no one was driving with brakes? Everyone would have to drive really slow, right? They'd have to probably drive at 5 miles an hour because the only way to stop would be to hit a tree or a wall or a pole. Hopefully not another person. But that's what... Oops. What happened to my slide? Sorry. I don't know what happened to my slide. Is that dead? Oh. All right, I'm talking about testing. These slides don't matter anyway. So the slide's just titled testing. So where was I? So that's what testing is about, right? It helps you build your application faster. So if you break something, a test case will tell you, hey, you broke something. Go ahead and fix this right away, right now. Because if you don't follow testing and you don't write test cases, then what will happen is that you'll end up spending so much time debugging your app that it'll slow down your workflow. So, which is akin to driving at 5 miles an hour. So if you're not already testing, I highly recommend that you look into it and start. Right. Absolutely. Well, I'm still going to cycle through these slides, but this one is called Knowing Your Tools. So I work with this teacher. His name is Jason Cipher. He's a Ruby on Rails teacher at Treehouse. If you guys are interested, he has really good videos on Ruby and Ruby on Rails. But I mention his name not to plug Treehouse, but because he has this amazing setup. His goal has been to minimize his time to mouse. So he uses keyboard shortcuts to the hilt. He knows keyboard shortcuts with for every application, and he has all these little utilities that can help him optimize his workflow. And it just speeds it up. And I'm not just talking about keyboard shortcuts. Why stop there? Have the most optimal workspace layout. Know your debugger. Know your command line foo. So the next time you're pair programming, you look like you have superpowers. But it's not even about, it's not even about impressing other people. It's about removing those little nuances from your workflow so that you can just get out of the way and get to the meat of the problem and build something. So knowing your tools. Are they showing? No? All right. All right, so the next slide is I like that I'm like talking about my slides. The next slide is a cliche. It's called sharpening your saw. But it's really about learning, right? Because what happens when you start cutting wood without sharpening the saw? You end up with a blade that's completely ruined. And that's the same, if you don't learn and challenge yourself, you're not going to be an effective developer. And I'm not just talking about learning a new language. I'm talking about like going out there and learning a new framework, an API, an SDK. Just get out of your comfort zone. Learn something new, even if it's something really little. And after you've learned something, build something with it. Because what's the point of just reading about something when you're not going to put that technology through its paces? It's like a car enthusiast learning about a new car, right? And this person just loves about everything about cars, the technology behind the car, the bigger engine. But they just read about it and they never get behind the wheel to experience the exhilaration of the speed, the tight corners, the braking. They're just reading about this. It's the same thing. When you read about a new piece of technology and you don't actually go ahead and build something with it, then you really haven't achieved much. Last year, I started reading a lot about these front-end frameworks, kind of like Backbone and Angular and Ember. And I thought, wow, these are like amazing technologies. Intellectually, I understood what they did. But it wasn't until last winter when I started building something just for fun. It's not something I had to ship or open source. I just wanted to build something just for the hell of it. So what happened was I had to first pick a framework because I didn't want to build something with all three of them. So I had to sit down and really review what's the best framework for the problem that I want to tackle. And then once I picked a framework, it was Angular if you're interested. And once I picked the framework and I started building something, I realized the limitations of the technology or the power of that technology. And I was just amazed with it. And I could have never understood any of that if I just read about it. So, dabble. That's the title of the slide, in case I forgot to mention it. All right, since I'm still talking about my slides, so this one is called Reviewing Code. For all of you back there, sorry, the projector's not working, so I'm just talking about my slides. So, has anyone here ever reviewed code? Right. What happens when you review someone else's code? Two things happen, right? One is either you learn something new that you already didn't know, or you learn something that you shouldn't be doing, right? So either way, it's a win-win situation. And if you don't work in a team, then go ahead and open an open source project. Anything that you love, see how they did it. If you work in a team and you don't have a code review process, then go ahead and implement one because it's highly helpful and I guarantee you learn something. So we're talking about learning, we're talking about dabbling with technology, we're talking about reviewing code, but the one thing developers think is that they work in a vacuum. And this slide is called connecting. I really highly recommend developers to get out there, get away from their screens, and start connecting with other developers. You know, go to meetups, conferences, places like this, and talk to people that you haven't talked to before, and try to understand the challenges and problems that they are working on. Just don't live in your own bubble, because you will definitely learn something, but you might also end up making a friend. So why not? Once you're connecting, take that a step further. All right. So all of these past slides have been about learning. But once you've learned something, why not teach? And I'm not talking about getting up in front of a room full of people to teach. You could do that, by all means do that. But you could do something as simple as writing a blog post. You know, you learned something, write a blog post. If you don't have a blog, come on, there's a million ways to start a blog today. But if you're comfortable with getting up in front of people and teaching, then go to your local bar camp, meet up, go to conferences, teach, because the best way to learn is by teaching. And the best way to learn something new is by teaching. Because it'll force you to gain that understanding of that new piece of technology, because you'll have to explain it to a room full of strangers. And finally, do I still have that? No. Oh. That was a nice slide, by the way. Sorry you guys missed out. This slide is called Walking Away From It. We spend so much time in front of screens. Now we have tablets, phones, laptops, TVs. There are so many screens now, it's maddening to some extent. Sometimes you have to escape from it all. You know, just turn off the screen, turn off your laptop, turn off your phone, go out there and do something with your right brain, because as developers, we're so logical. Engage your right brain a little bit. You know, go play a sport, create something, paint, draw, recite poetry, just do something creative. By the way, that is my last slide. I mean, I can't put the emphasis on engaging yourself into some creative activity, because you'll find that when you do come back to developing, you are that much more engaged with whatever you are doing, and you come back with a renewed vigor on the same project that you were working on, and maybe it got monotonous after a while. But once you walk away from it, you come back to it fresh, new. So that's all I have. If you guys have any questions, let me know.